Racist Karen blocks black teen from entering mall. The security guard's response leaves her speechless. Malik Johnson had never felt out of place in the small suburban town of Brookwood. It was the kind of place where people waved as they drove by and the streetlights flickered on at dusk, casting a warm, familiar glow over the tree-lined streets. It was quiet enough that you could hear the wind rustling the leaves or the chirping of crickets on a summer night. Brookwood was a town of comfort, of predictable routines, and for the most part, Malik had settled into his own version of that routine. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. At 17, Malik was the quintessential high school senior. He had a small circle of friends, all of whom lived in the same quiet neighborhood. They would meet up after school at one of the few local hangouts, either at the small cafe on Main Street, which served the best iced lattes, or at the mall a few blocks away. They didn't need anything fancy. Just a place to be together, share some laughs, and escape the pressure of high school life for a few hours. Malik's parents, both professionals, had moved to Brookwood when he was in elementary school. His mother, Dr. Andrea Johnson, was a well-respected pediatrician, and his father, James, worked in corporate management. They had chosen this area because it was known for its good schools, family-friendly atmosphere, and safe neighborhoods. Growing up, Malik had never wanted for anything material. He wore the latest sneakers, had the best technology, and his family was known for their involvement in the community. Despite the affluence of his family, Malik had always prided himself on staying grounded. He was humble and didn't flaunt his family's wealth or social status, preferring instead to just be like everyone else. That was the way he thought of his life. Normal. He was a teenager who went to school, worked a part-time job at the local cafe, hung out with his friends, and looked forward to getting his driver's license, so he could experience even more independence. His routine was filled with the typical milestones of any high school student's life: figuring out what college to apply to, studying for final exams, dreaming about summer vacations. But beneath the normalcy of his days, Malik was starting to sense a deeper, more complex reality in his life, a reality that, up until now, had remained mostly hidden. Every weekend, Malik would walk to the Brookwood Mall, a sprawling center of high-end shops, food courts, and entertainment options. It was a place where teens from all over the area came to meet up, browse the latest fashion trends, or just kill time. It was one of the few places that stayed busy on the weekends, and as a result, it had become a routine stop for Malik and his friends. Malik had first started visiting the mall when he was about 13. He remembered the excitement of going there for the first time, walking past the large fountains in the entrance and looking up at the gleaming glass windows of the stores. He marveled at how everything seemed polished, orderly, and perfect. The mall, in many ways, had felt like a small world of its own, separate from the rest of the suburban sprawl, a space where he could relax and escape into the buzzing energy of teenage life. His favorite part of the mall was the food court. The mix of smells from various fast food restaurants, sizzling burgers, freshly baked pretzels, the sweet scent of bubble tea, made the entire area feel alive. Malik would always meet up with his best friends, Antonio and Tasha, to grab a bite to eat. They would talk about everything from the latest gossip at school to what they planned to do after graduation. One of the things Malik particularly enjoyed about the mall was its atmosphere. It was a public space, and there was an unspoken understanding that everyone who entered was welcome to be there, regardless of their background or where they came from. As far as Malik was concerned, the mall was a safe space, a place where his social status, his race, or his economic background didn't matter. To him, it was a neutral zone, free of the judgment and stereotypes that he sometimes encountered in school or the wider world. It was a place where everyone could just be. But it wasn't until recently that Malik had begun to notice the subtle undercurrents of difference around him. He had always known that his school was predominantly white, and while he had never felt like an outsider there, he had also come to understand that his experiences were different from those of many of his peers. Malik had grown up in a neighborhood with a high concentration of white families, and although he had a few close friends of color, most of his classmates were white. He hadn't thought much of it before. After all, they were friends, and they treated him as an equal. Or so he thought. It wasn't until his junior year that Malik began to experience the occasional whisper or glance that made him uncomfortable. There were times when he would pass by a group of students who would suddenly go silent or exchange an odd look, and Malik couldn't help but wonder if it had anything to do with him being one of the few black students in his class. Even at the mall, where he had always felt at ease, he sometimes noticed people staring at him, or at least treating him with a kind of wariness that made him second-guess his place in the world. At first, Malik shrugged it off. People stared at all kinds of things, right? He was a teenager, and teenagers were weird. But as he grew older, he started to become more aware of the way the world looked at him. The assumptions, the sideways glances, the way he would sometimes be followed by security guards while shopping, these things started to get to him. It wasn't just about the isolated incidents. It was about the patterns, the fact that he had to always be aware of his surroundings in a way his white peers didn't. But still, Malik didn't like to dwell on these thoughts. He didn't want to be labeled as the angry black teen or the one who saw racism in everything. His friends, including Antonio and Tasha, were supportive, but they never really understood the deeper implications of what Malik was experiencing. He didn't want to burden them with these thoughts, so he kept most of it to himself. They didn't mean to make him feel isolated, but they simply couldn't relate to the complexities of growing up black in a predominantly white community. One of the few people who Malik felt truly understood him was Mr. Greg, the head security guard at the mall. Greg was an older, stocky man with a deep, gravelly voice and a warm, fatherly presence. He had been working security at the mall for years and had seen it all. He was someone who didn't just enforce the rules. He genuinely cared about the people who passed through those doors every day. Malik had known Greg since he was a kid. His father, James, was an executive at a local business and had worked closely with Greg's cousin, which was how the two had initially met. Since then, they developed a cordial friendship. Greg was someone who'd always made Malik feel seen, like he belonged. Every time Malik passed through the mall entrance, Greg would give him a friendly nod or sometimes stop to chat, asking how school was going or if he had any new hobbies. In a way, Greg was the kind of adult figure who grounded Malik, someone who made him feel like he had a place, not just in the mall, but in the world beyond his suburban bubble. But as the months passed, Malik started to sense a growing unease within himself. His comfort zone, his normal routine, the familiar faces, and the places he had once felt so at home, seemed to be shifting. He hadn't yet put his finger on it, but there was an undercurrent of change, something that whispered of challenges ahead. Malik wasn't sure if he was just growing up or if the world around him was changing, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was about to happen. And that change would make it impossible for him to stay in his comfortable routine for much longer. Malik had been looking forward to this Saturday all week. School was winding down for the semester, and the pressure of finals loomed large in the distance. But for now, he was free. His friends had been texting him all morning, and they were planning to meet up at the mall after his shift at the cafe. Malik had grown accustomed to this routine, working a few hours in the morning, then spending the afternoon with his crew, catching up on school gossip, joking about the latest viral videos, and trying on new sneakers or talking about the upcoming summer break. It was simple, but it was everything he wanted. He had gotten dressed quickly that morning, pulling on his new black hoodie, a gift from his parents for his recent birthday, and his favorite pair of white Air Jordans. The hoodie had a subtle logo on the chest, and the sneakers were still fresh, their soles practically untouched. It wasn't the kind of outfit that screamed for attention, but it made him feel comfortable, cool. He threw his keys into his pocket and left the house, making his way down the familiar street toward the mall. It wasn't far, just a few blocks, maybe 10 minutes on foot. As he walked, Malik didn't think much about the day ahead. He thought about how he'd probably grab a pretzel at Auntie Anne's and meet Tasha and Antonio by the fountain. Maybe they'd walk around the mall, window shop, or hang out at the arcade. Nothing too special. It was the kind of Saturday that felt effortless. The sun was out, and the mall was usually packed on weekends, with people in every corner enjoying their day. Malik had been there 100 times before. It was a place where he felt anonymous in the crowd, unseen, almost like a ghost, blending in with the hundreds of shoppers who passed through those doors. But on this particular Saturday, everything was about to change. When Malik reached the entrance of the mall, He was humming along to a song in his head, his earbuds securely in place. The sounds of the mall began to wash over him as he approached the automatic sliding doors. Laughter, the beeping of checkout registers, the chatter of teenagers on their phones, the hum of air conditioning. He felt the usual sense of calm that came with entering the mall. He had walked through these doors countless times. This was his turf, his space. It felt like a bubble, separate from the outside world. He barely noticed the woman standing at the entrance until he was almost right on top of her. She was positioned directly in front of the doors, blocking his path. She wasn't immediately threatening, but something about her stance gave Malik pause. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her lips were pursed in a way that seemed almost like a challenge. She was wearing an expensive-looking suit, her blonde hair pinned back in a neat bun. There was an air of authority about her, but it wasn't the good kind. She looked like someone who was used to being in control, used to having people do what she told them. Malik took a step back, startled by the unexpected obstruction. He pulled his earbuds out of his ears and gave the woman a polite smile, trying to gauge the situation. Perhaps she was just another mall employee or a customer with a lot on her mind. "Hey, excuse me, You can't come in," she interrupted before Malik could finish his sentence. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, almost like a command. Malik frowned, uncertain about how to respond. "What do you mean?" "I'm just going inside," he said, his voice still calm but now laced with confusion. The woman didn't soften. Her eyes scanned him up and down with a coldness that made Malik feel immediately uncomfortable. She didn't smile or make any effort to explain. Instead, she repeated herself. "You can't come in." There was no kindness in her tone, no recognition that he was a human being standing in front of her. She just stood there, blocking the entrance. Malik's initial confusion quickly turned to frustration. He could feel the heat rising in his chest.
"What?"
"Why?" he asked, still trying to make sense of the situation. He had never been stopped before, never once had someone questioned his right to enter the mall. This was supposed to be a safe space for him, familiar, neutral ground. What was going on? The woman glanced over her shoulder, as if seeking approval from someone Malik couldn't see. She looked back at him with a scowl, almost as if the act of speaking to him was beneath her. "You don't belong here," she said, her words dripping with disdain. "This mall isn't for people like you." The finality in her tone made the world around Malik tilt. Her words hung in the air like a slap, and Malik felt the sting of them deep in his gut. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way she had said them. The sneer, the arrogance, the dismissal. For a split second, Malik stood frozen, the weight of her words crashing down on him. He had heard people say things like that before in passing, under their breath. But it had always been distant, something he could brush off. This was different. She had said it to his face, without hesitation, with conviction. The truth of her message wasn't hidden behind veiled words. It was raw and unapologetic. He had faced racism before, comments from strangers, sideways glances, and whispered remarks in passing. But this was different. She wasn't just stereotyping him. She was denying his very existence in this space, as though his presence here was a violation. Malik opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come out. He had never been this angry before, never had his identity been so directly questioned. His mind raced, struggling to find a response that would put her in her place, but the weight of the situation left him speechless. How could anyone be this openly hateful, this blatantly discriminatory? Just as he was about to step back and leave, unwilling to escalate things further, something inside him snapped. He couldn't just walk away, not this time. Not when he was being treated this way, not when someone was trying to make him feel less than. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. "Who do you think you are?" he finally said, his voice rising just a little, filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You can't stop me from coming in because of the color of my skin. That's illegal." The woman raised an eyebrow, unfazed. She seemed to enjoy the power she had over him, as if the confrontation was a game to her. "I don't make the rules, I just enforce them," she said dismissively, as though the matter were settled. Malik couldn't believe what he was hearing. Was she really trying to justify this? Was she really going to sit there and claim that her actions were just following some imaginary rule that no one else was privy to? He had come to this mall 100 times before, just like everyone else. Why was he being treated like this?
What was different about him today?
He wasn't the first black person to walk through those doors, so why was this happening now? His frustration flared, and for a moment, Malik thought about just walking away. It would have been easy. He could have just turned around and left, gone back home, and tried to forget about it. But he couldn't. Something in him refused to let her get away with this. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts, when he heard a familiar voice behind him. Is there a problem here? Malik turned around to see Mr. Gregg, the mall's head security guard, approaching with a look of quiet authority on his face. Gregg was an older man, stocky, and with a face lined by years of work, but there was a warmth to him that made Malik feel at ease. Mr. Gregg had been working at the mall for years and had seen it all. He knew Malik by name, often greeting him with a wave or a casual conversation when he passed through the entrance. For Malik, Gregg had always been a reassuring presence, someone who treated him with the respect he deserved, never making him feel like an outsider. The woman's expression faltered when she saw Gregg. She had clearly not expected him to intervene, and Malik could sense the shift in the atmosphere as Gregg's presence filled the space. What's going on here, ma'am? Gregg's voice was firm, but it didn't carry the same venom Malik had heard from the woman. Gregg wasn't asking to be polite. He was demanding an explanation, and it was clear he wasn't going to tolerate anything less than respect. The woman straightened up, clearly taken aback by Gregg's sudden appearance. She opened her mouth to respond, but Malik didn't give her a chance. She's blocking me from going inside, Malik said, his voice calm but full of disbelief. She says I don't belong here. Like I'm not allowed in the mall because of the color of my skin. Gregg's face darkened slightly. He looked at the woman with an intensity that made it clear he was no longer playing games. Ma'am, you need to step aside, he said, his voice low and commanding. I suggest you leave this young man alone. The woman hesitated, clearly considering whether to challenge Gregg, but something in his tone made her pause. Her eyes flicked from Gregg to Malik and then back again, and for the first time, there was a slight crack in her confidence. She stammered for a moment before finally speaking, her voice strained. I was just trying to make sure everything was in order. Gregg's gaze didn't waver. You're out of line. You're not in charge here. Now move. After a tense moment, the woman took a step back, still muttering under her breath, but no longer blocking the entrance. Malik stepped forward, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the weight on his chest lifted. As Malik passed Gregg, he gave him a grateful nod. Thanks, he said quietly, his voice still tinged with the residual anger of the encounter. Gregg looked at him with a knowing gaze, offering a small, reassuring smile.
Any team? Sans.
Anytime. But as Malik walked into the mall, his mind was still racing. The encounter with the woman had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was questioning everything. The world he had thought he understood now felt like it was slipping from his grasp. Something was different, and it wasn't just the woman. It was something deeper, something about how he was seen in the world. The rest of the afternoon felt strangely disconnected. Malik stood at the entrance of the Brookwood Mall, his body still tingling with the aftermath of the confrontation. The doors had slid open with a soft whoosh, but it felt like the world beyond them had shifted. The familiar hum of the mall's energy, shoppers strolling, the soft chatter, the clicking of heels on the polished floor, seemed to fade into the background, swallowed up by a deep silence in Malik's mind. He was no longer just a teenager enjoying his weekend. Something had changed inside him. As he stepped further into the mall, a cold rush of air hit him, the kind that came from the air conditioning units overhead. He felt a sudden chill, not from the temperature, but from the realization that he was walking into a place that, until this moment, had always felt like home. But now it was different. Now it felt like an unfamiliar territory, a place where he no longer belonged. Malik's eyes scanned the mall as he walked toward the food court, trying to steady his breath. He passed by the familiar stores, the brightly lit windows displaying the latest fashion trends, the displays of luxury watches and handbags. It all seemed so trivial now, so surface level. How could he have ever been so blind? How could he have walked through these doors 100 times BF? And not felt the underlying tension, the subtle undercurrent of judgment? The woman at the entrance, the one who had so bluntly tried to stop him from entering, had made him question everything. Her words echoed in his mind. This mall isn't for people like you. At first, they had sounded like an isolated incident, a bizarre moment of ignorance from one individual. But now, as he walked through the mall, they reverberated through his thoughts, gaining strength, multiplying in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more her words seemed less like an anomaly and more like a reflection of a wider truth, one he had refused to acknowledge until now. He shook his head, trying to banish the thoughts. No, he told himself. Don't let her win. Don't let her make you feel small. But the more he walked, the more he felt her presence pressing against him, like a shadow lurking at the edge of his vision. The air felt thick, suffocating almost, as if every person in the mall was watching him, judging him. Every glance, every murmur, even the slight change in a person's posture when he passed by, it all felt magnified. He couldn't escape the feeling that people were looking at him differently, now that he had been branded by the woman's words, as if her contempt for him had somehow seeped into the very walls of the mall itself. He reached the food court and spotted Tasha and Antonio sitting by the fountain, their usual spot. But when he approached, they didn't seem to notice him immediately, too engrossed in their conversation. Malik felt a momentary pang of loneliness, a sharp ache in his chest. The familiar faces of his friends, the very people who had made this place feel safe, now seemed distant. Could they really understand what he was feeling? Would they even care if they knew? Hey, Malik. Tasha's voice broke through his thoughts. She looked up from her phone, flashing him a bright smile as if nothing had changed. Antonio followed suit, waving him over. Malik returned the smile, but it felt forced. He nodded and made his way toward them, trying to keep his emotions in check. But as he sat down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something that hadn't been there before. Yo, Malik, check out these new kicks I saw at Foot Locker, Antonio said, grinning as he pulled out his phone to show Malik a picture of a new pair of sneakers. Malik nodded absently, but his mind wasn't on shoes or the usual banter. He wanted to respond, to jump back into their easy conversation, but the words felt hollow. He could feel the weight of the confrontation still heavy on his shoulders, like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. Tasha, ever perceptive, must have noticed the shift in his mood. She tilted her head, studying him with a curious look. You okay, Malik? You seem off today. Malik hesitated, unsure of how to answer. How could he explain what he was feeling? How could he put into words the crushing sense of vulnerability and isolation that had settled over him? It wasn't just about the woman. It was about everything. It was about realizing that the very world he had lived in, the world he had thought was safe, was a facade. The sense of belonging he had once taken for granted now felt like a lie. I'm fine, he said, his voice coming out more curt than he intended. He glanced around the food court, noticing how people were going about their day, seemingly unaware of the storm raging inside him. How can they be so oblivious? He thought.
How can they not see it?
Tasha raised an eyebrow, but didn't press him further. Instead, she returned to her phone, scrolling absent-mindedly. Antonio continued talking about sneakers, completely unaware of the inner turmoil Malik was experiencing. For a moment, Malik almost wished he could be that carefree, that simple. But the weight of what had just happened, the way the woman had looked at him, the way she had made him feel less than human, kept him anchored in his thoughts. He tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on his friends. But even as he sat there, surrounded by laughter and the mundane chatter of the food court, Malik felt like he was slipping further away from them. The world around him seemed to grow distant, as if he were watching it through a glass window, detached and separated from the reality everyone else was living in. Are you sure you're good? Antonio asked, his voice a little softer now, his expression shifting to one of concern. You've been kinda off today. Malik looked at him, but his response didn't come easily. He didn't want to burden his friends with something they couldn't understand. They would never get it. They would never know what it felt like to be stopped at the door of a place that was supposed to be neutral, a place that was supposed to belong to everyone just because of the color of his skin. They would never know what it felt like to be told you don't belong somewhere, not by a stranger, but by someone who thought they had the right to define your existence. "I'm good," he said again, this time more firmly, but it felt like a lie. He wasn't good. He was far from good. The conversation shifted again, and Malik tried to follow along, but it felt like his mind was in two places at once. He was physically present, but mentally, he was still back at the entrance of the mall, standing face to face with that woman, feeling the sting of her words. And even though Greg had intervened, even though he had forced her to step aside, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The truth was, Malik didn't know what to do with this new version of the world he was seeing. Up until now, he had lived in a bubble of comfort, insulated from the harsh realities that other people, especially Black people, faced on a daily basis. He had never fully understood the ways in which race shaped the world around him, not because he didn't care, but because he hadn't had to. He had been able to live his life without feeling constantly scrutinized, without feeling like he was walking a tightrope, waiting for someone to point out how different he was. But today had been a turning point. It wasn't just the woman. It was the realization that his world was not the same as everyone else's. The fact that he had never noticed it before made him feel naive, almost stupid. How could I have been so blind? "Hey, Malik, let's grab some food," Antonio said, snapping him out of his thoughts. "You still want that pretzel, right?" Malik nodded absently, standing up as his friends led the way to the counter. But the same feeling lingered, the same unsettling awareness that nothing was as it seemed. He was entering an unfamiliar situation, one that no amount of distractions or pretzels could erase. And as he stood in line at the counter, his thoughts spun, grappling with the new reality he had been forced to confront. This wasn't just about a confrontation at the door. It was about a deeper, more uncomfortable truth about who he was and how the world saw him. It was about stepping into a space that, until now, had felt like his own, but now, that space felt foreign, uncertain, and fraught with the tension of a reality he had never had to face before. Everything felt off, and for the first time in a long while, Malik wasn't sure where he stood anymore. The next few days after the confrontation in the mall felt like they were dragging on. Malik couldn't escape the weight of what had happened. The woman's words had burrowed deep into his mind, and no matter how much he tried to push them aside, they kept resurfacing. Every time he walked into a room or passed by someone, a sense of unease settled over him. He wasn't sure what had shifted, but everything felt different. Even the simple act of walking down the street or stepping into school seemed to carry a weight he had never felt before. At school, Malik tried to act normal. He hung out with Tasha, Antonio, and the rest of his crew, pretending like everything was fine. But the words of the woman in the mall haunted him. "This mall isn't for people like you."
What did she mean by that?
What exactly was she implying? That he didn't belong in certain spaces because of the color of his skin? Malik had always been proud of his identity as a Black teenager. He wore it like a badge of honor, but the woman's words made him question everything. Was she right? The hardest part, however, wasn't what she had said to him directly. It was the feeling of isolation that followed. The moment the woman had looked at him and dismissed him as though he didn't deserve to be there, it wasn't just her opinion that had hurt him. It was the realization that there was an entire system, an unspoken set of rules, that might have been working against him without his knowing. It was like someone had handed him a mirror that reflected a truth he had never wanted to see. Malik found himself slipping into a quiet mood at home. He'd come home each day and retreat to his room, tossing his backpack onto the floor and collapsing onto his bed. The sound of his parents' voices downstairs was a distant hum, something he couldn't fully engage with. His dad, always the voice of reason, hadn't asked him how school was going in a while. It wasn't that he didn't care, but Malik had grown so accustomed to his father's distant, preoccupied nature that it was easier for him to stay in his own space. His mother, on the other hand, had picked up on his change in behavior almost immediately. "Malik, what's going on?" she asked one evening, her voice soft as she stood in his doorway. He didn't want to tell her. He didn't want to bring her into the mess he was feeling inside. It was one thing to confide in his friends. They wouldn't understand, but at least he could talk it through. But his mom? She had her own struggles, her own burdens. He didn't want to add to them. "I'm good, Mom," he said, shrugging as he sat up on his bed. "Just tired, you know? School stuff."
His mom didn't buy it.
She stood there for a long moment, watching him as if trying to figure out what was really going on behind his forced smile. Finally, she sighed, her voice soft but firm. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" Malik swallowed hard, his throat tightening. She has no idea. He couldn't bring himself to tell her what had happened at the mall. She'd never understand the impact of what had been said to him. She would tell him to brush it off, to keep moving, to rise above. And he knew she meant well, but that wasn't enough. So he did what he had done for the past few days. He nodded, and then he changed the subject. "I've just been thinking about the future," Malik said, trying to steer the conversation to safer ground. His mom gave him a long look, then nodded. "Well, keep thinking about it and keep pushing forward. But if something's on your mind, don't hesitate to share. You're my son. You matter." Her words, though comforting, didn't soothe the ache in his chest. They didn't make him feel like he could just forget what had happened. How could he forget? The woman's words had planted a seed, and that seed had started to grow, wrapping its roots around his thoughts, feeding on his insecurities. He could no longer walk through the world in the same carefree way. Malik tried to bury the experience, but it kept coming up in his mind, like an itch he couldn't scratch. Over the next few days, his thoughts became more scattered. He couldn't focus on his schoolwork. His mind kept drifting to the scene at the mall. That moment when the woman had stood in front of him, arms crossed, eyes cold. "You don't belong here." The words echoed, and he started questioning everything. He tried to occupy himself with other things. Homework, hanging out with his friends, even playing basketball after school. But nothing felt the same. At practice, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that his teammates were looking at him differently. He'd miss a shot, and it felt like all eyes were on him, judging him, assessing whether or not he was good enough to be there. It wasn't just the woman at the mall anymore. Now, it felt like the whole world was questioning him, his place in it, as if his very existence in spaces like the basketball court or the mall was being scrutinized. Malik began to question his friends as well. They were still talking the same way, joking around about everything, but Malik could see the invisible walls that had begun to form between them. They were a part of the same world, yet they seemed to move through it without ever questioning it. And that was the thing. Malik had been blind to it, too. He'd never had to think about race in such a visceral, personal way before. But now it was all he could think about. The turning point came one afternoon when Malik was sitting at the cafe, scrolling through his phone absent-mindedly. The cafe was crowded, and he had just finished his shift, waiting for his friends to come meet him. He was distracted, mindlessly flicking through social media posts, when an unexpected notification appeared on his phone. It was a message from his father. "Malik, I need to talk to you when you get home. I know you're going through something, and I want to help." Malik's stomach tightened. It wasn't often that his father reached out like this, especially in such an open, vulnerable way. His dad had always been somewhat emotionally distant, perhaps because of the hardships he'd faced growing up in a neighborhood much rougher than Malik's. But something in his father's message made Malik pause. It felt different, like his dad could sense what was going on inside him, even if Malik hadn't fully articulated it yet. When Malik got home, he found his dad sitting in the living room, looking more serious than usual. His father patted the seat next to him, silently asking Malik to sit. Malik hesitated, then joined him. The tension between them was palpable. "So," his father began, his voice low but steady, "I've been watching you lately, son, and I can tell something's bothering you. You've been quieter, more distant. What happened?" Malik didn't know where to start. He thought about what had happened at the mall, the words the woman had said, the realization that he didn't understand the world the way he thought he did. He didn't know how to explain it, didn't know how to make his father understand the confusion and the hurt that had taken root inside him. But as he looked at his father's face, he realized he couldn't hide it anymore. "Dad," Malik said quietly, his voice cracking just a little. "I don't know what's going on, but that thing at the mall? It's been eating at me. I keep thinking about what she said to me, that I don't belong, and I can't shake it. It feels like I'm seeing the world in a whole new way, and I don't know if I like it." His father's expression softened. He reached over and put a hand on Malik's shoulder, his grip strong but comforting. "Son, I know exactly what you're talking about. I've been through it myself." Malik looked up at his father, surprised. "You have?" His dad nodded slowly. "When I was your age, I faced some things you won't ever have to. But that doesn't mean you won't face your own challenges. You're going to encounter people who try to make you feel small, who try to tell you where you belong and where you don't. But you need to remember this. No one gets to decide that for you. Not her, not anyone." Malik sat back, trying to process what his dad was saying. It wasn't a magic fix, but it was the first time in a while that he felt like someone understood what he was going through. His dad had walked through his own version of the world, and maybe it wasn't so different from what Malik was experiencing now. He had survived his struggles, and somehow so would Malik. But it wouldn't be easy. It had been a few weeks since the incident at the mall, and Malik's world seemed to be shifting again. He had come to a conclusion, one that he hoped would bring him a sense of closure. The question of belonging, of his place in this world, had become more pressing with each passing day. But now, with the reassurance from his father's words and the weight of that woman's stare still fresh in his memory, Malik thought he knew what he had to do. He needed to reclaim his sense of power, to prove that he wasn't some outsider in the spaces that had been taken from him, or worse, assumed to be out of place. There were two things Malik had always known: his passion for basketball and his confidence on the court. His skill with the ball in his hands had never been questioned, at least not by his peers. He had been part of the team for years, and his love for the game had been a safe space, a place where everything seemed to align, a place where the world could be a little more fair, a little more straightforward. But recently, even that sanctuary had started to feel tainted, as if the world itself was scrutinizing every movement, every shot, every pass. It was after a particularly grueling practice that Malik decided he needed to push his way back into the world that he had once dominated with ease. He had been thinking about the mall incident again. The woman's gaze, the sharp, dismissive tone in her voice. That moment had stuck with him, burned into his mind, and he was tired of feeling weak in the face of it. He needed to prove something, not just to her, but to himself. He needed to prove that he belonged in the spaces he had always moved through with ease. So he went to Coach Henderson. The coach had always been a steady figure for him, someone who had seen Malik grow from a lanky kid with potential to a star player on the high school team. Coach Henderson had noticed Malik's quiet frustration, his hesitations on the court over the past few weeks. He had asked Malik if he was okay, if anything was wrong, but Malik had always brushed him off, not quite ready to voice his internal conflict. But now, Malik had made up his mind. He walked into the gym after school one day, his sneakers squeaking loudly on the hardwood floor. Coach Henderson was on the far side of the gym, reviewing some game footage on his tablet. Malik approached him, his palms sweaty, but a sense of resolve bubbling up inside of him. "Coach, I need to talk to you," Malik said, his voice low but firm. Coach Henderson looked up, his face softening when he saw Malik standing there. "What's up, Malik?" "I want to take my game to the next level. I'm ready to start for the varsity team," Malik said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. Coach Henderson raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the sudden declaration. "You've been playing well, Malik. But starting varsity is no small thing. We've got some serious competition on the team. You sure you're ready for that kind of pressure?" Malik nodded, feeling a rush of adrenaline as he spoke. "I can handle it. I'm ready to prove that I belong." Coach Henderson studied him for a moment, then sighed. "All right. If you're serious about it, we'll need to see you work harder. You're going to have to put in the time, the effort, and the focus. This isn't about just showing up. It's about earning your spot. But if you're willing to do that, I'll give you a shot." Malik's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. He had made the decision, and now it was time to back it up. This was the way he was going to take control, to push back against the uncertainty he had felt ever since that day in the mall. He would earn his place, not just in basketball but in the world. For the next few weeks, Malik threw himself into his training with an intensity he had never felt before. He practiced after school, working on his dribbling, his shooting, his footwork. He stayed late into the evening, watching footage of professional players, studying their moves, their strategies. He studied his own games, looking for flaws, always pushing himself harder. He started lifting weights with the team, his muscles aching with the strain, but he didn't care. Pain had become a signal that he was working toward something, toward that elusive goal of belonging, of proving that he deserved to take up space. Malik could feel his body changing. His shots became sharper, his movements smoother, and soon enough, he was playing with a level of confidence that he hadn't felt in months. His teammates began to notice, offering encouraging words when he sank a tough three-pointer or blocked a particularly fast opponent. For the first time since the confrontation at the mall, Malik felt like he was moving through the world with ease again. The world was starting to feel like it was giving him something back. And then one afternoon, it happened. Coach Henderson called him into his office after practice, and Malik's heart skipped a beat. Was this it? Was he finally going to be named to the varsity squad? "Malik," Coach said, his voice serious but warm. "I've been watching you. You've worked harder than anyone else. Your game has stepped up. I'm putting you on the varsity roster. Congratulations, you earned it." Malik's heart soared. "I did it. I made it." It was a moment of triumph, a moment where everything he had been working towards seemed to crystallize in an instant. He had earned this through sweat, sacrifice, and sheer determination. For a brief moment, the memory of that woman's cruel words, the sting of rejection, disappeared. In its place, there was pride in the fact that he had done something no one else had expected. He had carved out his space, proven his worth, and shown that he belonged. Malik's friends were ecstatic when he told them. Tasha and Antonio both congratulated him, high-fiving him, slapping him on the back. "Yo, that's what I'm talking about. You've been grinding, man," Antonio said. "We knew you had it in you." Tasha smiled and shook her head. "You're gonna kill it, Malik. You've always had it. Now the whole team gets to see it." For the next few days, Malik basked in the newfound sense of validation. He wore his varsity jacket with pride, his shoulders a little straighter, his chest a little puffed out. Every time he walked through the halls, people nodded at him, some with admiration, some with respect. He had earned his place. He had made it. But as the days passed, a subtle shift began to happen. At first, it was small, a fleeting glance from one of his teammates, a whisper that he caught when he walked into the locker room. He thought nothing of it at first. After all, Malik had always been a popular kid, confident in his own skin. But as the days went on, the whispers grew more persistent. Some of the older varsity players began to look at him differently, sizing him up when they passed him in the hallway, watching his every move on the court. During one practice, Malik was going hard, trying to impress the coach, but something felt off. His movements, his passes, they were crisp, but the energy of the team wasn't the same. When he took a shot, no one cheered. No one even seemed to notice. It was as though his success was somehow expected, as if the moment had already passed, and now he was just another player on the court. That night, Malik lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with a new, unexpected feeling: emptiness. He had worked so hard to get here, to claim this space, and yet it wasn't fulfilling him in the way he had hoped. He had gotten what he wanted, the varsity spot, the validation, the recognition, but somehow it didn't feel like enough. In the rush of achieving his goal, Malik had missed something vital. The victory he had fought so hard for, the one he thought would prove his worth, had come with a cost. The weight of other people's expectations had shifted onto his shoulders. It was as though he had stepped into a world that was no longer his own, a world where everyone was watching him closely, assessing his every move. And with that, the freedom he had once felt, the confidence he had carried with ease, seemed to evaporate. What had he really gained? The approval of others? The respect of his teammates? Or had he simply entered into a new kind of prison, one built from the expectations he had set for himself and others had imposed on him? For the first time since that day in the mall, Malik realized something profound. He hadn't really earned what he needed. He had fought for an identity, for a place in the world, but in doing so, he had lost sight of what truly mattered. The varsity spot, the basketball accolades, those were the things that the world valued. But Malik had been chasing something deeper, something more elusive: peace, acceptance, and the sense of belonging that had eluded him in the wake of that woman's cruel words. As he lay there, on the edge of sleep, Malik realized that the battle was far from over. This victory was only the beginning. It was an unusually hot day for late spring, the kind of day where the air feels thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken things. Malik sat in the locker room after practice, his body sore from the grueling hours of basketball drills and the constant push to prove himself. The cool breeze from the air conditioner did little to erase the sense of discomfort that had settled into his chest. His body had been through hell, but that wasn't the reason for the unease. No, it wasn't physical pain that had taken root in his heart. It was the gnawing feeling of being trapped. Malik had gotten what he wanted. He had earned a spot on the varsity basketball team, a place he had fought for, and had thought would give him the sense of fulfillment he longed for. He had won the approval of his coach, his teammates, and his peers. But now, after weeks of playing, after the adrenaline rush of games and practices, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The excitement had started to fade, replaced by a slow, creeping emptiness that he couldn't ignore. The day before, Coach Henderson had praised his performance during a big game. He had led the team to a win with a game-winning shot, a moment of glory that had made the crowd roar in approval. But when Malik had stepped off the court, there had been no overwhelming sense of accomplishment. No warm embrace from his teammates.
No celebratory cheers.
Just a nod, a couple of high fives, and then, as the adrenaline wore off, a heavy silence. In the days following the game, Malik had been treated like a veteran player. There was no longer the excitement of his debut, no more congratulations or kind words. Instead, there were expectations, as if it was no longer a question of whether he could perform, but whether he would continue to perform at this level every time. The pressure had started to feel suffocating. The weight of those expectations was like a constant pressure in his chest. Malik had begun to understand something that had been building beneath the surface all along. Success, the kind of success he had fought for, was not free. It came with a price, an invisible toll that few people ever talked about. Everyone saw the accolades, the respect, the recognition, but no one talked about the mental exhaustion, the constant strain of always needing to prove yourself, to live up to the image you had created for others. The whispers had started, too, questions about whether he could keep it up, whether he was really as good as people said, whether the championship run the team had made earlier in the season was something he could carry forward. The constant scrutiny was relentless. In the locker room, Malik ran a towel over his sweat-soaked face, trying to shake off the frustration that had been building for days. He had been part of the team for years, but being a part of the varsity squad felt different. It wasn't about camaraderie anymore. It wasn't about the simple love of the game. It was a business, and Malik was starting to feel like a cog in the machine. The moment he had worked so hard for, the moment that had been supposed to validate his place in the world, had turned into something he didn't recognize. "Hey, Malik," came a voice from the door. Malik looked up to see Antonio standing there, his brow furrowed in concern. "You good?" Malik shrugged, trying to play it off. "Yeah, just tired."
Antonio didn't buy it.
"You sure? You've been off lately. You've been doing your thing on the court, but something's off." Malik didn't respond right away. He didn't want to talk about it. He had worked so hard to get here, to earn this position, but now that he had it, the emptiness inside him seemed to grow. The victory he had fought so hard for felt hollow, and it wasn't just the basketball games or the endless hours of practice. It was the unspoken expectations that had taken root. The people who saw him as just a player, not as Malik the person. He was no longer a kid with dreams. He was a machine who had to perform. He exhaled, wiping his hands on his shorts.
I don't know, man.
I thought this would feel different. I thought I'd be happy when I finally made varsity, but now it feels like I'm just doing it because everyone expects me to. Antonio sat down next to him, his eyes narrowing in thought. I get it. When you get what you want, it's not always what you expect, huh? Malik nodded slowly, the weight of the conversation sinking in. Antonio wasn't wrong. The more Malik thought about it, the more he realized that the pressure wasn't just external, it was coming from within him, too. He had set the bar so high for himself that nothing seemed to feel like enough. Every game, every practice, he was pushed to be better, to do more, to perform like a machine. And when it didn't feel fulfilling, when the joy of the game was swallowed up by the pressure, he began to feel lost. It's like I'm not even playing for myself anymore, Malik admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm playing to live up to what everyone else thinks I am. Antonio gave him a long look, then shook his head. You're not just a player, Malik. You're more than that.
You've always been more than that.
But Malik wasn't sure anymore. Everything had been about basketball. It had been his escape, his way of proving that he could succeed, that he was capable. But now that he had achieved the success, it felt like the game had taken something from him. It had demanded his soul, his identity, in exchange for the validation he had so desperately craved. The worst part was that no one seemed to understand. No one could see the toll it was taking on him, the constant weight of the pressure he carried. His teammates saw the success, but not the cost. His parents saw the varsity jacket and the victories, but didn't notice the exhaustion in his eyes. Malik started to pull away, withdrawing more and more into himself. He wasn't sure how to navigate this new version of himself, the one who had everything he thought he wanted, and yet felt like he had nothing. He had worked so hard to prove that he belonged, that he deserved a spot, but now he was questioning whether it was all worth it. Was it worth the sacrifices? The sleepless nights? The isolation? The constant pressure to live up to an image? The next week, Malik found himself in another situation that further intensified the cost of his success. It was after a particularly brutal loss in a major game, a game where Malik had played his heart out, but the team had come up short. The locker room was tense, filled with the sounds of frustrated teammates slamming lockers and cursing under their breath. Coach Henderson had pulled Malik aside, his face tight with disappointment. You had a great first half, Malik, Coach said, his tone measured. But you dropped off in the second half. We needed you to finish strong. Malik's heart sank. He had felt like he had given everything. His legs were sore, his hands shaky from the tension of the game. But Coach was right. He had fallen short. And the worst part was that the weight of that failure wasn't just his, it was the team's. It was the school's. It was his own expectations of himself. I know, Coach, Malik muttered, his voice flat. I'll do better next time. Coach Henderson looked at him for a long moment before nodding.
You better, Malik.
You're one of the best players on this team, but we need you all the way. The stakes are high now. We don't have room for mistakes. That night, Malik couldn't sleep. The weight of Coach's words pressed down on him like a 1,000-pound stone. He had been given everything, this shot at varsity, the respect, the glory, but now it was clear that nothing was ever enough. No matter how hard he worked, how well he played, there would always be someone else watching. Always someone else ready to judge. The victory he thought he had won was slipping through his fingers, and no matter how hard he tried to hold on, it wasn't going to give him what he needed. He was just a player, a tool to win games, not a person anymore. In the days that followed, Malik began to question whether all the sacrifices were worth it. He had pushed away his friends, distancing himself from Tasha and Antonio, who had always been his grounding force. He had stopped talking to his parents about what was really going on. They saw the success, but they didn't see the toll it was taking on him. The loneliness that had crept in since his victory seemed to grow more profound with each passing day. Malik had achieved what he thought would fill the hole inside him, but now that he was here, he realized it had only deepened the emptiness. The victory that had once seemed like the answer had proven to be only a part of the puzzle, a puzzle that, no matter how many pieces he put together, still left him wondering if he was truly whole. He had gotten what he wanted, but at a price he hadn't anticipated. The sense of belonging he had sought, the validation he had craved, had come at the expense of his own peace of mind. And now, He had to face the painful reality that what he thought he wanted wasn't what he needed at all. Malik sat on the worn leather bench in the corner of the gymnasium, the noise of the basketball team's practice swirling around him like distant echoes. He wasn't playing today. He wasn't even sure if he wanted to play. The weight of the past few weeks had settled like a stone in his chest, heavy and unshakable. Coach Henderson had noticed his absence of energy, his distracted gaze during the drills, but had said nothing. His teammates, too, had stopped offering the usual encouragements, sensing that Malik was in a different place now. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. Something inside of him had shifted. The gym floor creaked beneath the quick steps of players moving in synchronized drills. Balls bounced, sneakers squeaked, and shouts of instructions filled the air. But Malik didn't hear them the way he used to. He used to live for the rhythm of the game, for the thrill of pushing his limits, for the way the ball seemed to find its way through the hoop. Now, it felt like he was watching from the outside, disconnected from the game that had once been his sanctuary. The echo of Coach Henderson's disappointment after the loss had lingered with him, a reminder of how far removed he had become from the player he used to be. The weight of success had turned into a burden, and he wasn't sure he could carry it any longer. He wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere in the struggle to earn his place, he had lost himself. He had sought validation, the approval of others, the chance to prove that he could belong in spaces that seemed to reject him. He thought that by achieving his dream, by becoming a varsity player, by securing that spot on the team, he would finally silence the voices that had told him he didn't belong. But all he had done was drown out the wrong voices, the voices of doubt, in favor of new, louder ones, the voices of external expectation. Malik had made it. That much was true. But at what cost? He had sacrificed his peace, his joy, his sense of self for the recognition that now felt empty. The victory that had once seemed like the answer to all his struggles now felt like a hollow shell, a gilded cage that had replaced the freedom he once felt when he played simply for the love of the game. The worst part was that no one saw it. No one understood the emotional toll the success had taken on him, because all they saw was a player who had made it, a kid who was living the dream. No one saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the confusion in his heart, or the deep loneliness that had settled inside of him. The turning point came one evening after a late practice. Malik had walked home alone, the sun setting behind him, casting long shadows across the street. He had hoped for some clarity, some answer to the confusion that had clouded his mind for so long, but nothing came. He was no closer to understanding how to reconcile the player he had become with the person he used to be. He walked past his usual hangout spot with Tasha and Antonio, the place where they used to shoot hoops for fun, and stopped for a moment to watch them play. Tasha was taking a shot as Antonio guarded her, their laughter echoing down the street. Malik felt a pang in his chest, a longing for the simplicity of those moments when basketball had been just basketball. When the game hadn't been a contest to prove anything but a way to bond with friends, to feel alive, to escape for a while. He missed those days. He missed feeling like himself, before he had let the pressure of external validation shape his every move. He lingered there for a while, watching the two of them play, until he felt a hand on his shoulder. Startled, he turned to see his father standing behind him. Malik hadn't expected to see him here. His father, a quiet but wise man, had always been a steady influence in his life, but lately, Malik had kept his distance. He had retreated into the bubble of his own success, unwilling to let anyone see the cracks that were starting to form in his armor. "Hey, Malik," his father said, his voice soft but firm. "You good?" Malik hesitated. He hadn't been honest with anyone, not even with himself, about how he was feeling. "I don't know, Dad," he admitted. "I thought this would be it. I thought getting on the varsity team would fix everything. But it hasn't. It feels different. I feel different." His father nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I know what you mean. Sometimes we think that getting what we want will make everything better, but it doesn't always work that way. You've been working so hard for this, for that spot on the team, for the validation. But have you stopped to ask yourself why you're really doing it? What's the real reason you're playing?" Malik shook his head, unsure of how to answer. I thought it was about proving something, proving that I belonged, that I was good enough. But now that I have it, I'm not sure what I've really accomplished." His father smiled gently. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone, Malik. Not to me, not to your coach, not to anyone else. You've always been enough. You've always had value, whether you made the varsity team or not. The game isn't about the trophies or the recognition. It's about the love for it, the joy it brings you. If you've lost that, then maybe it's time to find it again." Malik stood there in silence for a long moment, the weight of his father's words settling over him. He had been so focused on the external, on earning his place, on securing validation, that he had forgotten the heart of the game. He had forgotten why he loved basketball in the first place. It wasn't about being the best or being seen as worthy. It was about the joy, the freedom, the challenge. It was about being himself, not a version of himself that others expected him to be. The following days were filled with a mixture of REFL, action and action. Malik didn't jump back into his old routine of pushing himself to the brink of exhaustion. He didn't go back to the relentless drills or the endless practices. Instead, he took a step back, something he hadn't done in months, and really thought about what he wanted from the game. He spent time shooting hoops with Tasha and Antonio again, just for fun, like they used to. He spent afternoons working on his shot, not because he had to, but because it felt good. Because he loved it. Malik realized that he had been so consumed by the need to prove himself that he had missed the simple joy of the game. It wasn't about the trophies, the accolades, or even the varsity jacket. It was about the love for the sport, the rhythm of the ball bouncing on the court, the camaraderie with his friends. It was about being present in the moment, not in the future or the past, but in the here and now. But even as Malik found his way back to himself, the pressures didn't disappear. They couldn't. The external world still demanded results, still measured him by his performance on the court. The whispers still lingered in the locker room. The expectations were still there. But Malik had changed. He had a new perspective. He realized that he could still play for the team, still strive for success, but not at the expense of his peace. He didn't have to carry the weight of everyone else's expectations. He didn't have to prove anything. His worth wasn't tied to his performance. It was tied to who he was as a person. And that truth, his truth, was liberating. When Malik returned to the court, it was with a sense of ease that he hadn't felt in months. He wasn't playing for anyone's approval. He wasn't chasing after the next win to validate himself. He was playing because he loved the game. He was playing because it made him feel alive. And that was enough. The following season, Malik found himself back in the starting lineup, but this time, things were different. The pressure was still there. Of course, there would always be expectations, always a sense of urgency to perform. But Malik had learned to separate his worth from his achievements. He was still a part of the team, still a valuable player, but he was also a person who didn't need to prove himself to anyone. He had found peace in the chaos, balance in the pressure, and, most importantly, joy in the game. As he walked off the court after a game-winning shot, surrounded by his teammates who were cheering and clapping him on the back, Malik smiled. But this time, it wasn't the smile of someone who had finally earned their place. It was the smile of someone who had found their way back to themselves, someone who knew that the game and life was bigger than the accolades or the external validation. It was about playing for the love of it. It was about finding joy in the struggle, in the hustle, and in the journey. And that was enough. Malik had returned to his familiar situation, but he had done so armed with a new truth. He was enough, just as he was.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.